You have made it to our session on combating epistemicide and deflecting the white gaze through liberatory accountability as a way of expanding on the culturally responsive and equitable evaluation practice. Or we could have just called it claiming liberation. Here today, I am here with my wonderful three friends, Shawna Murray-Browne, who is my sister, daughter, leader, companion, collaborator, Dayvon Love, who is another respected youngin for whom I have found guidance on my evaluation, and my close collaborator, brother Michael Scott, who we have been up to much liberatory activities together, each of whom brings ideas that have expanded my understanding of how to be engaging in liberatory evaluation, something that we are currently co-creating. We're talking about, we're exploring, even as we co-create that in our own efforts together today. So rather than give any deep uh, what does that mean? I don't know what's going on. Rather than give any like long introductions to everyone, what I have designed for today is that we'll have 10 minutes from each of us to share what we're going to share, and everyone can introduce what they need to about themselves in this work. I'll be last, and then we will take some time for conversation with the second half of our session. Before we get started, I do want to allow anyone who would like to make what I'm now calling a solidarity acknowledgement, seeing as I didn't take the land. I'm always uncomfortable with land acknowledgements for land I didn't steal. But solidarity acknowledgements for the land that you're coming to us from, and any ancestors you want to call in, either in the chat or open your mic right now. You're more than welcome to do so. I'm gonna drum for like another 30 seconds to a minute and just bring that in.
I'd like to honor the spirit of my grandfather, Samuel Murray, and my brother, Darrell Murray, my grandmother, Lily Struther, my great-great-great-grandmother, Sarah Brown, and all those ancestors known and unknown that come in love and light that have guided me in my way forward.
Highlight the men in my lineage: Paul Freeman Scott, my father, his father James Scott, and his father, my namesake Michael Lee Scott.
Call on my ancestral lineage: Sally Mae Love, Ross Love Sr., Ross Love Jr.
I thank everyone for calling in the ancestors. I call my father, Bobby Peak, and his mother, Davy Della, my mother's mother, Henrietta, and all of those ancestors who brought us safely to this day through much trial and tribulation, and with much innovation, with much celebration and audacity. All right, so I'd like to now kick it over to Shawna Murray-Browne.
Awesome. Thank you, Mama Geri. So I am really excited to hold the space for us to be able to contend, for me to be able to share something of an experience that has blossomed over the last few years around my journey and intention to uproot epistemicide. If we understand what epistemicide is, it is the destruction of ways of knowing. And so because I only have 10 minutes to really delve in, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about my doctoral journey that led to the insights I'm going to share. So I am a third-year doctoral student in the School of Social Work at the University of Maryland, Baltimore. And my experiences throughout my journey have been that of feeling othered, feeling silenced, and being very much told that things central to my identity were contrary to what it meant to be a scientist or what it meant to be a scholar. And so my intention has been in the perpetual sort of path to maintain my values and what it means to be liberatory, that my work is for the liberation of Black and Brown people. That is, that liberation is collective and freedom is individual. So that I'm seeking my own personal freedom, but I'm working for the liberation of my people, and that every aspect of my work and life needs to be in alignment with that. And so this activity, this process, as a result of that, I had to take a theory class in my doctoral experience, and none of the theory classes accessible to me felt in alignment with what it is I needed to spend my time doing to be able to fortify in Black liberation. As a result of that, I created my own course, and what I'm going to share with you are some of the inquiries that and a framework that I created after sort of contending with the experiences of my grassroots work, my experience as a priestess in the Ifa tradition and in Hoodoo, as well as what I was experiencing in my own lived experience, and trying to translate this sort of interruption of the destruction of the ways of my people and the knowledge of my people and those whose land I'm on and steward. And be able to integrate that into what it means to be a researcher, or what it means to be a historian, or what it means to be a social worker. And so what you'll find is that I am using words around decoloniality and anti-colonial orientation. And as I'm expressing these things, you will find that I deem anti-colonial work being against all colonial structures and entities, and decolonizing work being first the act, recognizing that decolonization is not a metaphor, but recognizing what work needs to be done to ensure that we actually commit to that decolonial act. So I went through an experience of really assessing in my particular field of social work how theories were established and how they were identified as being valid and true. And then I instead created and am sharing with you today 6 inquiries for assessing anti-colonial and liberatory interests. I will preface this by saying that I have found that these 6 inquiries have helped me in my work as an integrative psychotherapist, where I'm training therapists on how to decolonize their therapy practice. So they've utilized these same inquiries when assessing what modalities and interventions should be used when serving Black and Brown and Indigenous peoples. I've also found it useful in assessing or establishing, identifying theories to ground intervention creation in the social work field, as well as we are contending with what does this mean in evaluation research. And so when Mama Geri attended this sort of presentation that I asked her to come to, that's when I began to realize the multiplicity in the ways in which these things could be grounded. And so the first of the 6 inquiries is really the question that is important for us to ask is, does whatever intervention research or evaluation research we're doing, or the theory that we're using, does it seek to explain an inquiry posited by the community being explored? What do I mean here? What I'm really talking about is, if you are evaluating a program that was executed in Baltimore City with Black boys, are you seeking to explain a question that the Black boys in the community have a question about their own lived experience, about their own journey? Or are we centering the very colonial interest of the institution or the organization with which we're serving? and please do type in the chat if you have questions, insights, or reactions about the things that I'm sharing as I'm sharing them, because when it comes time for us to be able to do our talkbacks, I would love to delve more deeply here. What I noticed and the relevance of this is that across the board, at least in my particular field in social work, is that oftentimes we're asking what are white supremacist questions about how Black people function, as opposed to what do the people and community have questions about that might lead to their actual collective liberation. The second inquiry for assessing anti-colonial and liberatory interest is, does this evaluation, the theory, or the intervention seek to contribute to the destruction or dismantling of present colonial systems in an effort to envision something new? And so this often gets people to be quite uncomfortable here, because we do understand that we should and are working collectively and collaboratively in a larger whole. But the question is really, is your evaluation going to interrupt and shatter, do more than interrupt, but seek to shatter and disintegrate parts and pieces of the colonial system, and then pave the way for those being served to imagine a new world? The third question is, can the evaluation, the theory, or the intervention contribute to the act of decolonizing? Now, I honor both of the sort of prominent definitions of decolonization, but first sort of centering the repatriation of land and life. And I ground in the perspective that African peoples are indigenous, though not to this land, but to the continent of Africa. And how do we take on this global perspective of, is this work contributing to the repatriation of land and life here on what is now called the United States and what's often called Turtle Island? And can it be applied, or can it be applied in a global context? We could also use the term decolonization as it relates to reorienting our focus to original ways of knowing. So does it contribute to the act of the repatriation of land and life, land back movement? Does it contribute to the act of centering Black ways of knowing and healing? Number 4 is, does it center the axiology and wisdom of the interest group? Here, I'm really grounding in pre-colonial, sort of ancient value systems and wisdoms of the people that are being studied or evaluated. Does it center the value system of white supremacist values, of only things that can be counted, of a focus on controlling the land, of a focus on more is better? Or is it centering the axiological system and the worldview of the Black folks or the indigenous folks, where the intervention, theory, or evaluation is assessing? The 5th is, does it acknowledge historical and systematic context of oppressions? I think that we can pretty much, if we're here, we could pretty much say, that we're confident that we're acknowledging historic and systemic context of oppressions, but in an effort to sort of ensure, to double check, this is a question we should be asking on a continual basis to ensure that we are not causing harm, but we are actually paving the way for healing those historical traumas. And then we are acknowledging the ways in which the systemic context of oppressions harms those that we are serving. And then the last is the theory, intervention, or evaluative outcome made accessible to the population it seeks to explain. That is, after you do your evaluative research, are the outcomes being positioned in a way that will ensure that that my auntie and them and that folks in the community have the ability to be able to use that insight and data for their own self-determined vision forward? Or are these outcomes being posited specifically for organizations and institutions that seek to maintain power for control? Okay, that was a lot of words. I tried to make sure that I could get it all in. And so those are the 6 inquiries. I am fine with sharing the document, but I really don't want to go over my time. But if you have comments or questions or feedback, I welcome folks to drop that in the chat so that when it becomes relevant, we can begin to contend with the ability to be able to apply these very same sort of inquiries in all levels of our work.
Well, I was completely mesmerized, as I was the first time I heard you present this in the full presentation, and you ended right at 10 minutes, which shows that you are calling on all the magics and all the conduit to make it happen. Susan is just saying she loves this, Sean. Thank you for offering these transformative. Susan, if you want to open up the microphone and just finish what you were going to say.
Hi, sorry for the typo, but just this is a really beautiful sounding, and I think questions are so powerful, and I really appreciate that you have questions that, I don't know, I want to implement this in my practice like right away. This is wonderful. Thank you.
That's what I said. Awesome. We can maybe take another one or two, just either love responses or questions before we move on. This is how it's going to go. So you might as well come up here and share some love. It's a different kind of session. It's all right. If it's your week is like mine, you're probably on a different call while you're trying to be on this call. So it's okay.
Well, I'm sharing the screen in case folks wanted to take a look at it again. But yes, please do comment or unmute yourselves if you have any questions or comments.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
And really, I think it starts from your number one point here. And I love this presentation. I'm very excited to be here. And I'm wondering, I am also a third-year doctoral student studying health equity and social justice. And I'm wondering, I guess, about number one. I feel like I intuitively know the answer to this, but I'm wondering how many folks does it take to qualify as a community, particularly if you as a researcher are a member of that community. So in my particular area of study, I'm looking at, or I'd like to look at experiences of childhood sexual abuse and the impact on kind of postpartum mental health.
Mm-hmm.
And as a member of the community, I am taking that to say that, to some degree, of course, share conversations with other folks who've had these experiences that essentially is enough to say this is a community claim. And like, how do we describe healing mechanisms and how do we use that to kind of, create interventions from that? But when I was like, ooh, well, I am the community that's positing this. So hopefully that counts as number one.
So that's a perfect question. Thank you so much for asking it, and sending love to you on your doctoral journey. Okay, so I have two thoughts about this that I can share pretty succinctly. The first, for me personally, is I use a particular framework around how we understand the concept of community, recognizing that often community is thrown around as like this thing outside and not inside when you're navigating white oppressive systems. And so for me, I use I have a little c community, which is a community of self, the folks in my actual village that hold me personally accountable, right? For me, this would include Dayvon, Michael, and Mama Geri, because we actually have a literal community of feedback and ongoing engagement, but it also includes the community of people in the city of Baltimore that actually know who I am, that I actually can go to for support. Then I have the big C community that might be the entire city of Baltimore, people that I'm in relation with because we exist in the same sort of land space, but don't actually know who I am. And then, and considering that, I think that we have a responsibility of one, acknowledging those of us that are actually a part of the community that we are serving, and honoring the listening that we've had to do throughout our lived experience that might mirror some of the many experiences of those in our little c community. But I also think that it is important, because of the ways that we can be tainted when we are navigating these white and institutional systems, to actually really be in grassroots community while we're navigating these institutional structures, to ensure that we maintain our sort of critical consciousness and awareness, because there are so many parts of us that must be shed in order to be successful in these spaces. And so for me, it's not less about the number, it's more about the lived experiences of what's being amplified.
Thank you. That makes perfect sense. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Absolutely.
So I think that we will go on. And again, if you have questions, you want to document them in the chat, I will try to catch them, especially if I get tossed off. But I want to move on to Dayvon, who is, I don't know exactly what you're going to say, but he wrote something amazing that changed my whole entire mind. So hit it, son.
All right. Good afternoon or morning, wherever you are. Appreciate the invitation, Mama J, to participate in this. You know, I come at this. So I'm Dayvon Love. I'm Director of Public Policy of an organization called Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, grassroots think tank in Baltimore City. So the primary thrust of our work is political, but we do some work that, you know, could be considered direct service, particularly around education and youth. What I want to do, and what Mama Geri mentioned, the piece that she's referring to, a piece called "When Baltimore Awakes," and so I'm gonna talk about that. I'm gonna give a little bit more just context to my organization, because it'll inform what I'll discuss about the paper that was referred to. So. LBS as a political organization, one of the things that we're really clear about in terms of our worldview is we're really explicit about having kind of a Pan-African worldview, understand the importance of African sovereignty and self-determination as the basis for any real material form of liberation for people of African descent. And the notion of sovereignty and self-determination is something that's often obscured, marginalized in many liberal and even mainstream progressive spaces. And that's one of the things when we were founded in 2010, because Baltimore and the state of Maryland is, you know, for the most part, a Democratic Party stronghold. So you have a lot of professed liberals and progressives that dominate government, that dominate the philanthropic sector, that dominate, you know, many of the government agencies that provide services to the community and many of the folks in the nonprofit sector. But we were still seeing many of the same, you know, deplorable conditions for people of African descent, you know, here in Baltimore City. And so we started our political analysis from the perspective of answering the question, why is it that we have all these professed folks who say that they're interested in racial equity or structural racism, and yet the system still reflect a white supremacist structure and framework. And so one of the things that we have been critical of for many years is the nonprofit industrial complex, because we became clear that the way in which white supremacy is maintained in liberal and progressive spaces is around a set of principles that aren't captured by, you know, for instance, criticizing folks that are advocates for, you know, tough on crime legislation or mass incarceration. That there's certain types of notions of the way that white supremacy operates that, given those conversations, it doesn't illuminate. And so as we began to become more clear about our critique of the nonprofit industrial complex, we wanted to write something comprehensive that will provide our perspective on what's fundamentally problematic about the nonprofit industrial complex, and really including in that conversations about the human social service sector in general, right? So all those institutions and programs that play a role in providing services to the community. And so that led to what we call our Black paper, as opposed to a white paper, When Baltimore Awakes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay out just some of the major themes in it, you know, for the sake of time. So we start with a quote from Hubert Henry Harrison. He's a renowned scholar and speaker in Harlem in the 19 teens and 20s. In his text, Negro and the Nation, where he describes the difference between pre-Civil War chattel slavery, and the position that Black folks operated in post the Civil War. And what he describes is that the difference between chattel slave, the difference is that what we had before was chattel slavery, we have now is wage slavery. That chattel slavery is enforced by brute force, and wage slavery is enforced by starvation. And that's particularly important in understanding the nonprofit industrial complex and the way that the human social service sector is designed in general, because it is that plantation framework that is enforced by starvation that governs much of the activity of the nonprofit industrial complex. And so one of the reasons for us, for LBS, to write such a piece is to deal with the politics, because I think there is importance in talking about those who are service providers, evaluators, program administrators, but we wanted to get to the politics of the human social service sector and the way that those politics produce certain approaches to human services that re-entrench the system of white supremacy and European domination of the world. So that's kind of where we start. And we start with an analysis of the system of white supremacy as kind of a sociological fact of life, right? It is a sociological fact that the system of white supremacy governs the distribution of resources, governs really every arena of civil society. And what we identify is that there are three major aspects of the human social service sector that constitute it being white supremacist. One is that the emphasis on notions of Blackness and narratives of Black people that are rooted in notions of inherent pathology, right? So that's one. And I'll circle back to these later. Second is that the methodologies that are used currently within these systems are rooted in methodologies based in white supremacy. And lastly, that the people and the institutions that are in charge of the institutions that provide these services typically are not reflective of the communities being served. So those are kind of the three major pieces that we say help to constitute why it is that the human social service sector is rooted in white supremacy. And so I'm going to take each of those and then just kind of wrap into the conclusion that we come to in the piece. So this piece around notions of inherent Black pathology are important because given the way that even in so-called enlightened spaces, much of the research that is done about Black people is done from the perspective of trying to fix what's wrong with Black people. And even in context where Black folks, where there's an understanding of the system of white supremacy, oftentimes what is lacking are narratives of Black people operating as self-sustaining, sovereign people able to address our own issues, right, societally. And oftentimes this requires knowledge of history prior to the domination of Western civilization to develop narratives that don't require dependence on the intellectual tools and structures that are rooted in the European canon. And so a part of what happens is that much of the way that Black people are characterized are primarily as recipients of services, and much of the programming that is produced is structured in a way that is rooted in this notion of Black people primarily as recipients of services and Black folks as primarily being oppressed. And this isn't to say that the material conditions of Black people are not important for us to be clear about, but what it is to say is that Black people should not be reduced purely to our position societally in terms of the system of white supremacy. So that's particularly important. And one of the stories that I tend to use to make this point is years ago, I was a debate coach. I was coaching a high school debate team, and there was a gentleman who I was helping out who was also a coach. And he said to me, Dayvon, Europeans were traveling the Atlantic Ocean and traveling the oceans really before Europeans were. And my first thought was, why do we always have to have these conspiracy theories of Africans doing stuff first? And, it's hard enough to get people to understand that racism exists, like that's going to be discrediting and all that. And a few months later, I came across a YouTube video with a lecture from a man named Ivan Van Sertima called They Came Before Columbus. And then I eventually read the book. And I came to two conclusions. One, that Africans were traveling the oceans before Europeans were. In fact, this whole thing about folks thinking the world was flat, Europeans were some of the only people in the world who believed that folks had already, had that navigational expertise. But the second thing I recognized, I was like, why was I so willing to be dismissive of that idea? And what I concluded was that even though I was knowledgeable about the system of racism and white supremacy, I had not encountered narratives of people of African descent operating in arenas marked as high levels of civilization. And so as a result, it was beyond my own capacity to imagine people of African descent operating at that level. And so if you think about then the kinds of programming that is produced, right? If many of the folks that are produced by many of these institutions, that is a limitation of their imagination. Programs are being structured in such a way where that is embedded in that. So that's the piece around pathology. Piece around white supremacist approaches and methodologies that are produced in the human social service sector. So a part of, and the kind of marginalization of alternative methodologies. And again, the paper gets into this, but I'm
going to give you 2 more minutes, Dayvon, because you're just getting there. 2 more minutes.
Got you. And so the methodologies that are rooted in white supremacy, many of them understand people as individuals outside of their cultural and communal context, as opposed to understanding folks in their cultural communal context. The kind of the reverence of objectivity and notions of scientific objectivity in ways that really beneath it have behind it kind of dominant societal notions. So those are some of the elements that make a methodology white supremacist. And oftentimes what this does is that it marginalizes other kinds of knowledges that come from much of the cultural technologies that come out of people of African descent and other indigenous people that could be used as methodologies to solve many of the problems that we see in our society. And so their approaches to education, health, et cetera, that are off the table because of the way in which notions of racism and white supremacy can conceptualize other methodologies that exist outside of the mainstream. What I'll end on is that part of the issue, and I mentioned in the beginning that for us, wanting to understand the politics of the human social service sector, that for us, from the political perspective, pushing against the existing thought leader infrastructure that essentially curates the kinds of things that are elevated to best practices, and that the politics around that are important in elevating a thought leadership that is based in the community, that is socialized and approaches to human service, social work, public health, all these other proximate fields, producing thought leadership that is rooted in a paradigm, liberatory paradigms, that can then restructure the way that a lot of these programs are administered. And so, again, the focus for us and the reason that we wrote the piece is to provide some language for people to politically challenge the networks that have essentially used the needs that Black people have as a community as a way to carry out a colonial project to maintain our dependence on institutions that aren't qualified for our uplift and that actually are perpetuating our dependence, taking away from the importance of our sovereignty and self-determination. So I know that was a lot of information, short amount of time. I'll leave it there.
So let's have a couple of questions. Actually, you did an excellent job. Once again, I was mesmerized, even though those are the 3 things that have set me on a whole new journey. And so I already knew what you were going to say. But please, if anybody has questions or comments or love to share, it's your time.
I do want to bring the attention to folks that if you look in the chat, I did link the Black paper that Dayvon was reflecting on in the chat.
Thank you, Shawna. This is the sound of minds having been blown. Why don't we keep it moving with Michael Scott and blow some more minds?
Hold on, Geri. You know, I'm going to time myself. You know, I'm going to get my European axiology on right now and time myself. Hey, everybody. I'm Michael Scott, Equity Matters, and we're a network and culture of equity practice and equity practitioners. And our equity framework, equity leverage framework, we affectionately call the ELF, came about really as a culmination of about 12 years of work, and we had a chance to develop a piece for Kaiser and have then applied it in other settings. And really, it's based on the concept of using leverage to achieve equity. But it's really about a space of, some call pracademics, right? So people who have some academic sensibilities, but only play academics on TV, but are really practitioners. It's about the connection to my ancestors in the center of Central Maryland's Underground Railroad. And so we think of this work as agents and operatives and provocateurs of equity and how we practice and fail forward and make mistakes. And so the learnings that we achieve, and it's really that axiology that says that, that old saying that you don't want to be a gardener in a war, you want to be a warrior or a warrior in a garden. We want to be warriors who garden. We want to be prepared, but we want to practice our equity and our peace bringing forward. So I'll share with you a little bit about the equity leverage framework. And I think the place to begin is understanding that we all have some of this knowledge, and we have to acknowledge the Creative Commons of some of our friends like Alan Frimpong, Kwabena, June Holly. But a lot of this stuff, as Mama Geri will say, was stuff Black folks have been doing for centuries, and then someone decided to write it down. So we have to acknowledge the both end of that, right? And we also have to acknowledge that our types of knowledge, to pick up where Dayvon left off, in the Yoruba, there's a knowledge called Ita, and there's another one called Igbagbe. And it's information that you know directly, and there's information that you inherit from elders. And when the two overlap, you get a really powerful truth. And so that is the truth. Those are the learnings that we're trying to surface, right? And so when you think about leverage, what's going on when we go from the theory to the practice? And what's really going on is, as we say in the Institute, People's Institute's language, is you have systems insiders and gatekeepers who are accountable to the systems that are paying them. Or for, if it's not financial always, it is certainly incentivized, and they end up exploiting, underserving, and marginalizing the communities that they serve and from which they come from, often based unintentionally and often unhealed. And so they are themselves exploited, underserved, and marginalized, and they exploit and marginalize those people. So what the point is that we're looking for a way to shift that accountability that Dayvon talked about, that Shawna referred to. And really the issue is we're in a complex system. If you've ever heard of, complex adaptive systems, you probably haven't spent a lot of time thinking about what does that mean practically. Well, practically, when we talk about racism, people talk about whack-a-mole, right? That's how folks have explained it to me. It keeps shifting. It's shape-shifting. It keeps changing. Well, that's actually the definition of a complex adaptive system. So a complex problem, it doesn't have standard or established solutions. We don't yet have a developed response to the challenge, or they haven't proven effective. And so there's a sense of urgency in that challenge. So we said, why don't we take the tools of complex adaptive systems to solve those problems and apply it to racism? And so this model is the Kinevin Framework. Kinevin is a Welsh word that actually means my place of multiple belongings. And Dayvon referenced best practices. What we find is that most people are in a complicated or a clear pattern. So that's how their institution, their organization works. But most of the modern problems are on this other left side of the domain. they're complex or adaptive. They call for very different practices. And so we find ourselves trying to hire the right person to hit the easy button to make all our lives problems. And then that just never works, right? What we're suggesting is that what you have to do is find the actual leverage point in order to make a major difference in the lives of the people you serve. There's a European, because we have to speak in various languages, right? So there's a European thinker, philosopher, Archimedes, who said, "Give me a lever long enough and a fulcrum on which to place it, and I shall move the world," right? And so what we're trying to do is to help leaders understand the mindset, their readiness, whether or not they are actually able to imbibe the tools and practice the tools, and then finding the place to apply those strategies. In this concept, the people are actually the bar. The lever has, two component pieces. It has the fulcrum, which is the equity lever, and it has the bar. The people are the bar. So what you're trying to do in this practice is to align people in the different ways that they show up to be able to impact the leverage that both Dayvon talked about, but is also based on the knowledges that are important to them. And so part of what we do is have an adaptive action cycle. This is one example we're using in Howard County. It's probably a little easier a diagram of it. And each of those pieces means something as you create a learning community for them to emerge the wisdom that exists in community. So we're not able to only rely on experts who want to talk about best practices or even good practices, right? Each of those words means a thing. What we're doing is we're suggesting that we think about movements differently. We think about our networks to solve problems, and there's reasons for that. Movements have cycles, they have states. You have shared infrastructure, which produces very different outcomes than if you don't have infrastructure, right? You just kind of repeat the same cycle. We see that in many systems and institutions, right? The different methodologies of trades, the infrastructure, the structures, and the methods are different when we're focusing, on the subcomponents that make them up. So when we start to think about a much larger practice, there's a lot of different ways we can start to shift things, right? So I'm going to stop with the slides. There's too many slides. But basically the concept is stories are like stars. If you have enough stories and you collect them, you get, just like stars collect into a constellation, stories collect into narratives. If you have enough constellations, you get universes, and then on up to galaxies. If you have enough narratives, you get culture. So a lot of the work we're seeing and doing starts with the philosophical basis, right? The cultural differences and how we understand them. That's the axiology. They then move to the people, because all institutions are made of people. And those people in those institutions don't live in a vacuum. They live in a system that has been emerging over years. And so now they have a culture. And under that culture are the narratives and the stories that define the decision-making and behavior. What we're trying to do is to surface the component parts where you can shift and make change. So a lot of our work is in conscious lifting, racial equity analysis, and conscious raising. But there's another part of our work that actually doesn't require true believers. It requires people who are hyper-focused on a leverage point. And we've seen that as we've been in 27 cities and across the country with Place Matters and a health equity movement. We've seen people that really don't buy the whole thing, but they believe in the people connected to them, that relational organizing. And what they're able to do is to create space and cover for those people to do their thing. So we've seen that there. We've also seen it in the movement for mass incarceration, which is now entering into a new phase into the defund work and divest invest. So we see the power of movements in promoting equity, and we see how if we're intentional about our networks, if we're intentional about our leverage points and intervention points, and we do the both end of conscious raising as well as looking for the leverage points, we can start to engage a larger universe of people to examine the culture, the narratives that underlie and either support imagination or inhibit possibility, and then looking at the stories. And I'll leave you with one of my favorite koans, which is, what would happen if you examine the story from which you derive identity, which is based on a set of people, right? So there's a set of people, either in group, out of group, y'all or us, from which you derive your identity. What would happen if that story changed? What would it mean for your practice? What would it mean for equity? And those are the leverage points that we're looking to engender from both a pracademic standpoint and folks who are out there, practicing and failing forward. I'll pause there.
Thanks, Michael. That was right on time. So I'm just going to open up to see if people have any questions or just shout outs. If you want to put some love in the chat. I see some conversation going on there, but if anyone has any questions. If not, I'm going to go ahead and share from my perspective. And so my inspiration for this conversation was the way my mind was blown. Really starting with Dayvon and the 3 premises. He puts them right in the executive summary. I was stopped before I even got into the Black paper, because those 3 premises suggest a way of conducting inquiry that can support communities, that can completely revive, enliven, and transform the way that evaluation is conducted. Then later in the fall of 2019, we didn't know what was coming. We just thought we were hanging out. I went to, in that December, I went to Shawna's presentation, and the 6 questions, those 6 inquiries, I was like, I can use those inquiries whenever I work with a client. Like, this is really, like, every time I sit down with someone, I can use them, even if it's only to push back and say, given what you're trying to get, thinking of funders who fund initiatives, and they just want to have an indicator set. The whole idea of having an indicator set that can tell you what we need to know about everything, it's something we're used to doing, but I would put forward that's something that also comes from dominant culture axiology, where trying to know everything that can be known before we actually know, before we actually get out there and see what's going to happen. I had a question in my email this morning. Can we use these measures I'm thinking of, because I've got to have a response today? I'm like, it's interesting, because we want to talk about how people feel valued, or do they value? Like, we have to figure out what that means before we even go forward. But we have a pressure to define what we're going to get before we even walk down the road and find out what is there. So these questions and inquiries, they led me to rethink evaluation from a standpoint of this longstanding equity work that, I started working with Michael in fall of 2011, I think, in Equity Matters, and really teasing out that there's a distinction between equitable practice and liberatory practice. And there are folks defining those, but my simple definitions of those things are when someone is working to redress the harms of the existing society and help people to navigate it with or without their own voice. Lots of people are doing that without someone's voice, completely meaning to be helpful, but whether or not it's with the voice of community, big or small c, it centers the existing society. And as Shawna so clearly said, and everyone has followed up on, when we are focused on liberation, we're looking to upend those structures in society that are oppressive, harmful, violent, marginalizing. And I would say that, from my standpoint of being someone, I don't even talk about who I am. I'm Geri. I used to be a social demographer, but now I'm calling myself a spiritual demographer because I look to the fundamental core of who we are as people as guidance, as all people have from the beginning of time, since ever someone stood up and said, a vision was brought to me to help us progress, and people said, okay, and some said, I don't think so. I don't think you saw nothing. We followed some kind of spiritual guidance. So this is spirit guided work that we are doing today. This work was guided by spirit and put in the hearts and minds of people, whether it was through revelation, whether it was through, as Dayvon described, recognizing the constriction in how we think that keeps us from seeing beyond what we've been told to learn and know. So for me, this has started a journey. I know I have written something about this collaboration boot camp that I was going to put together, and I talked to some of my friends. One of them is Shawna. Michael's sort of along for the ride. Another sister here in Baltimore who got this big foundation job. And I was like, they don't have time to help me figure this out. But what I really learned is if I'm going to write a workbook on collaboration, then I need to do it within communities who are struggling with collaboration. And isn't that all of us? Giving the space to say, so part of our problem is we want to advance, but we don't want to hear from somebody else as an individual. That's white dominant culture seeping in along with personality to keep us from deferring to collective. We're afraid that somebody else's idea might mess up our thing. We don't want to hear from somebody else because we think we figured it all out. That's mighty white, as we used to say back in the day. That's mighty white. And so I want to just show one image. And there's only one thing I want to share, the share screen, because as folks were talking, as everybody was talking, I thought about this image. I'm sorry, I forgot that when you share from the Chrome tab app, it mutes you automatically. So can you see this? It says the gem of understanding. So, and everyone has talked about an aspect of this. I think Dayvon was really articulating it, that we have a way that we're trained to think and know that we consider to be education. This is just education. And so that's a gem, right? If we make this, and we maybe have a cutout, we can color it in, that's a gem. But we also know that a gem has more than just those 5 sides that we see. It's multifaceted, right? So we could say if we take more information, this would be more accurately a gem shape, yeah? But gems aren't flat. They're 3-dimensional. And now we've multiplied the different windows into knowing into that gem. We can see it from different perspectives. It refracts light differently. We get more information from it. But I say, what if we were inside the gem? What if we were inside the gem? All right, roll your eyes, Michael, because I know you've heard this like 1,000 times. But if you're inside the gem, you're looking out and you only favor one view. You're discounting all the other views you could have. I say that when we're marginalized and oppressed, we are forced into one view, and we have to take command. We have to be brave enough, and we have to be willing to potentially have some self-injury as we push back against something that's holding us in place. We might strain something, we might pull something, we might even break something, but then we'll be able to look through a different facet. What we're hearing today about liberation, this is the gem. It don't have to be cut and curated by a white gaze or viewpoint. This is a geode that has stalagmites that are covered. It's Now I'm forgetting, I really love this stone, but that green stone, the stalagmites or tights, depending on which way it naturally formed, are covered in this chalcedony, which is sort of a milky crystal. It's not shiny, it's not clear, but there are worlds to explore in there. So I would posit that, we're not saying this is not some sort of linear and simplistic, go back to Black ways of knowing and other indigenous ways of knowing, and we only know from there. What we're positing is, if we think that reality is this flat gem and it only has 5 sides, when we've explored 5 sides, we've done the work. If we recognize reality as a complex ecosystem and landscape, where there are multiple ways of viewing it, and these multiple ways of knowing, it doesn't keep us in the past. But imagine if, instead of being forced to not think in the ways that people naturally were thinking, everyone was free to think that way, and we shared it, we could discover a multitude of different ways of understanding. Instead, we're limited to one way that actually aligns with a debunked way of knowing, the Cartesian Newtonian linear perspective that has been, at least in physics, been given way to a quantum approach, where we notice that, if we're looking at a particle, depending on how we look, depends on how it seems to move, right? So no, there's not a real thing as quantum social science, but I think social science has, depending on how we look, we see different ways that it moves. But we've been convinced through our education, especially as people who deal with data, that only some kinds of data are rigorous and others are not. And that's what I think some of what we've been postulated has given to us. So I'm going to just stop there, because I forgot to turn my timer on. I have no idea what time it is, but I think it was after 12:35 when I started, so I'm okay. And what I'd like to do is just take a pause for any questions for any panelists that you might want to ask now, and then we're going to just spark some discussion. And if you guys don't have questions, we're just going to start talking amongst ourselves, which I think would be very robust.
I want to illuminate a question by Contayani Murray. The question is for all of us. What are the panelists' thoughts about engaging with funders of evaluation, government, and philanthropy around liberatory frames? I do have an answer to that, but I wanted to make sure that we all got it. So we can get ready to answer that dope question. So I'll start. So my thoughts about it are actually, my thoughts about engaging with funders of evaluation, government and philanthropy are actually informed by my experience of engaging with engaging mostly with folks in the realm of philanthropy and foundations. And I think it's twofold. Okay, so there's a pool of folks that, because I am powerfully authentic from my LinkedIn page to my website to when I show up, when I'm using the term liberation and I'm talking about decolonization and anti-colonial frames, in my effort to decide that I'm not going to code switch and I'm not going to sort of mute the truths of myself, there are a lot of conversation that just doesn't happen because they're not interested from the jump. I'm not, it's not my walk to sort of alter myself to sort of lure folks in. But what I found in the conversations I have been able to have with funders around about evaluation and liberatory frames is that two things happen. They become wild and, oh, I didn't know, and please tell me more. But they also sort of fall into the common behavior of trying to decide what they can do with me, as opposed to asking me how I think it would be best for these insights to be applied across these frameworks. So folks are curious, but they're also extractive and exploitative. And I think that without some joint frame, that could be challenging. I also think that it makes them powerfully uncomfortable because they like to be in control of their funds and what happens with their funds. But there have been some successes seen here in the city of Baltimore around redefining the ways that we do evaluation and having folks and foundations on board.
Can I add to that? Because I think that last piece of you being controlled, right, is a certain direct remnant of practice of white supremacy, right? And so I think my short answer is you have to have alchemists as evaluators who can speak to the real needs of community as well as address those needs and those impacts in a way that funders can hear, and that takes some kind of gymnastics and alchemy. But I also say that the structuring of it, and so, you know, when we structure our work, the way we decenter best practices and even good practices, which is still an expert-oriented practice, is that we structure, the sense-making, as it were, right? The listening of story. So we center those who have the most wisdom because they're closest to the problem, and try to create structures that allow for innovation through experimentation. You know, that systems not only thinking, but where you can actually identify some things, but also to decentralize these processes as much as possible means that they're not looking, well, how can I control Shawna? Or, you know, gatekeeper trying to control, you know, the other gatekeeper, which is always like, you know, bring me to your leader, and that they can speak for you. But if you have a network as a leader and you have a process by which they can be heard and acted and learned from, it's harder to control one network than it is one person. So I'll pause there.
Yeah, I'll add something quickly to extend on both what Mike and Shawna said. One of the reasons that we wrote When Baltimore Awakes is because, as I mentioned, we wrote it thinking from a political perspective. How can we put pressure on institutions to behave differently? And I think one of the things that is underutilized is the use of organizing politically to direct the distribution of resources. So I think there's the piece of it where it's navigating the existing thought leadership and those that are in control of the resources, but there's also a place around, how, because like I said, LBS is a political organization, but we're clear about the importance of those who serve our community. And so we use the leverage that we have to direct resources. And so there's kind of a symbiotic relationship, between like those of us on this panel and forming like what kinds of liberatory practices, need to be supported so that we on the political front can talk to our legislators and other kinds of public officials to pressure them into becoming advocates for liberatory practice. And I think that's something that I think particularly those who see themselves as a part of movement activity, that I think that's particularly important, is developing that relationship between those who are service providers, who have liberatory approaches to doing, delivering service and evaluation, and those who are squarely in the kind of political arenas where decisions can be made around resource allocation.
I just want to comment, because when Michael and Dayvon coming together is what I'm talking about when I'm saying like there's work to be done that is being done, that is reorienting, and it is a long walk. It's not something that you're going to see in, year 3 of funding for whatever. It's something that, because we are hyper focused in on the city of Baltimore and the political sort of intellectual structures, we are seeing our progress happening over years of time.
And I just sorry, go ahead, Geri.
Oh, thanks, Michael. No, so go ahead and say what you put in the chat, and then I'll go.
Yeah, no, just that, because we start talking about government and academy, and it also applies to those funders, right? We have to invert the power of the people. First of all, they didn't make that money. It's all got blood on it, right? All of it. And it's ours. So that's one thing. But then, you invert the power when you understand where the money came from, and they're learning communities that can support that, where other funders who've come into a higher consciousness can talk to other funders, both investors and philanthropy. So, and Geri and I have been a part of that. So I just wanted to put put that in the chat.
Yeah, and then I'm going to take this, like these are both and statements. These aren't dichotomous. This is it's that whole gem that we're exploring. So another answer to the question is that I don't think that much about engaging funders of evaluation, either government or philanthropy, around liberatory frames, because in the end, what the liberatory frame is trying to do, is to unseat them. So that requires a spiritual transformation where somebody says, oh, I'm a human. So a friend of ours, with Equity Matters, talked me into taking this class with Bayo Akomolafe. And I hadn't really heard a lot of his work. And so we got together and we hear some music and stuff, it's cool. And then we talk for a little bit in small groups, and then we hear from some lecture stuff. So we had a question around, what do you do? And we were instructed to not to talk about our work, but if we had to, we could introduce our work and move from there. Years ago, I stopped introducing myself as my work because that's not who I am. Even though I love my work and it's essential to how I am, but it's a bad precedent. Don't do it. And I told the people that what I do now is conjure change, help, service. And in a future, the other part of the question is, in a future where these capitalist mechanisms and patriarchy was gone, what would you do? I said I would do the exact same thing, but I would do it with no white people. And the three people in my group, an Asian woman and a white woman and a white man. And then I said, what I mean by that is that if we are in that future where we have disconnected capitalistic, patriarchal, limited, harmful, oppressing ways of behaving, then the constructed notion of whiteness will have been completely left behind. Then comically later in the lecture, Bio talked about Blackness being taking on the liberatory standpoint. And I say all the time, it's like, I love being Black. I love Blackness. That's my social orientation. At the same time, it's a false science, and I'm a scientist, so why do I keep repeating it? Further, if you uphold white supremacy and these systems, then you're white. I'm waiting to go into a meeting and tell somebody Black they're white and see what happens. You're so white. But you're upholding that system. And when we break those systems, if we just break them politically, which is going to come first, we have to do it. That only gets us room to maybe grow some more. But when we really transform and become new humans, we won't understand how we were ever the way we are. And we can call that Black for now. When we get there, we'll call it whatever we call it.
Kantayeni, did that answer your question?
Yes, it did. I really appreciated hearing all those perspectives. And just so I don't think that all of you know, but I was a program officer for 7 years, and I'm coming out of that role, and but also have the opportunity to influence philanthropic practice in my current role. So I'm just grappling with how to help philanthropy to be helpful and not harmful. Though I appreciate what you were saying, Geri, about ultimately, bringing the liberatory frame is unseating them. And I did want to throw out there are some like less than a handful of philanthropies that have accomplished, are thinking about funding themselves out of philanthropy, which is, a way of not necessarily that they are funding their way out of philanthropy toward liberatory practices for BIPOC people, but that is a practice that can be advocated for some philanthropies to be thinking about not perpetuating inequity and racism and white supremacy through giving their power away completely.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really important. The example I gave earlier of the email that I got, that was from a foundation that's supporting the artists of color movement in Hartford, Connecticut. It's very exciting. We have so much exciting work with people who are striving to do this. But even in the collaborative Michael mentioned, when it comes to the land someone was sitting on, building power with the hereditary chief of the peoples of that land, it broke our collaborative. And it's morphed into something else. It's found new life through, there's a philanthropic institution that recently founded, Liberation Ventures. They're called Liberation Ventures for a reason. They started by people of color, and they mean that. There are other things where the energy that we had came together, but the question of white allies in a collaborative of organizers sitting on the land of someone else and in the collective and raising the question, so what you gonna do about my land? Give it about that land thing. What about you sitting on my land right now? This is the chief. And it broke our collaborative because they weren't ready to say, I think the easiest thing to say is, I don't know, like we bought this land for money and this is making my whiteness nervous, but can I start with putting a sign saying this is your land, and then we can start thinking about what we do about that? Because I'm like, bro, because I bought this land. But that's not what happened.
And it's an interesting point too there. The chief said you could also vociferously advocate for all this other land around it that the state owns and use your power that way. And so, yeah.
I just, in an effort to also like, thank you for sharing, Katayani, about like your role and what you're thinking. The other reality and alignment with what Dayvon was talking about earlier, but did not have the opportunity to go really concrete when sort of trying to transform who the thought leaders are. The really practical activity is education, right? So, you know, there are like through LBS, there's an initiative, the new Timbuktu Community Education Institute, that is actually providing education around these frameworks in an effort to sort of initiate different conversation around what it actually means in practice.
And there was a question in the chat. Help me if I'm saying your name right, Diego Molina, about your ancestral practice and being from Brazil. And it's interesting, like a part of our work is recognize. Someone told me once, I think it was at the Whitman Institute.
Wait, Michael, can we read the whole question out loud, because it's really a deep question?
Yeah, great. I was sitting
I can read it. I'll read it.
Yeah.
Unless you'd like to say it yourself, Diego, if we're pronouncing your name correctly. If so, please unmute yourself. We'd be happy to have you state it.
Mm-hmm.
A second and see. No? Okay. Okay, go ahead.
Wait.
Oh, no, in Portuguese, we would say Tiago.
Tiago.
Like Chicago. It's near than T in the US. But that's okay. Tiago is perfectly.
Awesome.
Thank you.
So Tiago, do you mind articulating your question that is typed, or would you prefer me to read it?
I type it because I'm not sure so fast in English, but I can hear it.
Okay.
Oh, I would like to hear a little bit about the limits of the concept of epistemicide. While this concept is a powerful concept to denounce the Western effort to annihilate any non-Western system of knowledge, we are here. We are discussing how to liberate these people supposedly epistemologically annihilated, and we are here playing our drums, drawing insights from ancestral systems of knowledge, and mainly we are saying out of loud that we are alive on the shoulders of our ancestors. And I would like to hear you. How do you feel this question? I'm in Salvador, maybe you know, is the blackest city outside Africa. Mm-hmm. So the African heritage here is very strong. Yesterday in my presentation, I brought the experience of some schools, public schools here in Salvador that we try to frame Yoruba traditions, contextualize the knowledge we teach in the school. So, but how in the last point, a powerful Black leadership here, Sueli Carne, helped to frame this concept of epistemicide in 2005 in her PhD dissertation. She is a powerful Black activist here, but only from some years ago, the concept of epistemicide go back in our discussions, at least in the academy, and even in the Black movement. So I would like to hear your perspective on that.
Thank you, Tiago.
Yeah, let me say a quick word. So we might have some intersections. So one of our team members is working with the Stephen Biko Institute in Bahia, and so I'd love to hear his perspective. But I can say that part of our work with what was formerly Old Money New Systems before it became Liberation Ventures was, there's a West African concept and Maladima, I can't say his name.
Malidoma Some.
Thank you. I'm doing three things in the background. Malidoma Some's people, the Dagara, say that to heal yourself, you have to heal your ancestors. And so when we were in process of looking at this big shift culturally that's happening in the U.S., where 30 trillion with a T is being inherited by mostly millennials from mostly boomers, and it's 70 trillion over 25 years. And a lot of these young people have different values than their ancestors. So you're seeing this show out in boardrooms, both philanthropically and in investment boardrooms, right? And so there was one story that was actually happening from a wealthy family that made its money extracting resources from Brazil, from the Amazon. And the person is a woman of color, and the elders said to her, listen, I don't know what all these young people are talking about with this sustainable energy stuff. Rule number 1, don't lose money. Rule number 2, don't lose money. Rule number 3, if you lose money, you might go away. And she was in tears and saying, I was clear. I was taking the phone call from a satellite phone in Brazil where they were killing people, right? And so there's this moment where the values that are emergent, the empathy, does not fit the systems that we're seeing. And so we have to find ways to encourage and build movement-wise that strength and shift the givens that we assume will never change in philanthropy and in investment. And so I would say, we should keep building and keep finding those leverage moments and opportunities, because I don't think it's long-term work, and there are moments of breakthrough. And so I think we have to be about that business. And I would say abolitionists over allies. And I'll pause.
So
yeah, go ahead, Shawna.
I won't say much, but what I wanted to articulate is that I think that you make a great point, Tiago, when you talk about the fact that how can we say this, that we are the recipients of or experiencing epistemicidal sort of violence while we are talking about it. And I think that we have to contend with the both and of the reality. In the piece by Eve Tuck and Yang on Decolonization is Not a Metaphor, they articulate that settler colonialism is a project. It is an ongoing happening. It isn't something that happened and stopped happening. It is something that is perpetually happening until we stop it, until we actually decolonize. Similarly, I would say that when we're talking about interrupting epistemicidal action, that we have to talk about it until it's not relevant. What we know for sure is that our infrastructures and apparatuses that are ensuring that, that we recenter our focus to white ways of knowing and thinking, and as a PhD student, I am presently in the battle of trying to still recenter Black ways of knowing, even though in my day-to-day life, I might be able to have these conversations with you. And so I would say that yes, we are thriving in many ways because we are having a conversation, but what does it look like when epistemicide is of the past, right? We need to talk about it so that we can continue to establish the institutions and structures from a liberatory perspective, a new world and way of thinking where our multiplicity of ways of knowing, our multiple axiologies are embedded in the structures and systems.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add that for those of us who see ourselves to be evaluators and researchers, that we're talking about movements, we're talking about organizing, we're talking about educating and re-educating. For us, this is about rigor, it's about accuracy, it's about excellence. If truth is one, if there's truth, there's like this circle of truth, we are all stuck in a capsule of belief, things that we think we know that we believe are true. And the only way to get out of your capsule belief is to interact with others collaboratively so that you begin to see what things are and what things are just what we think. The other piece that we have as people of color, as evaluators, researchers, and other professionals like our colleagues on the panel, we have resources because we got work. Sometimes, if you're an independent consultant, you don't know when your next job is coming, you're worried about that, so and so. It's not the same as not having a job, living unhoused or poorly housed. We have money. We have $25 that we can do, not to do something that is seen to be biased by our actual understanding of truth, but fuels, for example, Shawna, wish you could come and hang with us in our Liberatory Learning Circle, but she got that doctorate to get. I have a group of women who are looking at liberated practice of evaluation. And it's like, we could just organize and raise some money so that we have a structure around what we're doing so that people maybe can take some time. Maybe we could have one of the lead scholars. These were lead scholars. I can't afford to do it this year because my money's not like that. Maybe it could fuel lead scholars to take do some of the work that we need to do, compile some of the information, interview people about their ways of knowing, bring that to us so we can utilize that. We have that kind of power, but as a profession that is trained that unbiased means to hang back and do nothing, it's very hard to break that set of behaviors. So I want to stop there. I know Dayvon looked like he was in transit, but I wonder if you have something to say as we close out to 1:15. 3 minutes left.
Yep. I would just say that, one of the most important things around understanding anti-colonialism as a framework for everything that we do is that the knowledges that are the basis for many of the professions that are proximate to the professions of those that are on this panel, those on this call, those knowledges are inherently exploitative, and much of it, when we think about the way in which Black suffering and the suffering of the majority of peoples of the world is the basis for business models that uphold many of the systems that exist. It's important, I think, the connection between our practice as anti-colonial and what it means for how we organize politically. And so I think, drawing those lines between, how one delivers a service, how that service is evaluated, the institutions that finance it, the paradigm that those institutions are rooted in, and our own practices, our own embodied practices, drawing the line that connects all of those things is important. And I think when that line is drawn, the necessity for understanding colonialism as central to the way that this society is organized, I think comes to the fore. And I think it's grounding for the kind of organizing needed to shift practices and institutions in ways that empty into a liberatory process.
So I think we are rounding on the end of our time together. I just put a little quote in there. There's a song called All Nations Rise. Lila June, I think is the artist, singing about Indigenous people of America experience. And she has this line, "It's been a tough run, but get ready for the sequel." So I really feel that interrogating our relationship to epistemicide and our freedom to speak about it and to bring our ways of knowing and new ways of knowing built up from those ways of knowing into practice, that is our privilege. It's our honor and it's our duty. So I wonder if any last words. Last time we didn't get cut off till we stopped talking, and I know that there's going into a plenary, so people will have to leave, but if there's anything else people want to say, yes, just stay in contact with Shawna Murray-Browne on LinkedIn, ShawnaMurray-Browne.com, Michael Scott, easy to get to. You can make friends with us and reach out to us. And I will also say that my 3 friends are not evaluators. They agreed to come to this conference. It's virtual. $250, that's a lot of money to come to a conference. It's not even your profession. So if you reach out to me, Geri Peak at Geri at twojumpconsulting.com. And if anybody wants to give tips to my buddies, you can. I always come to CREA. I don't need a tip, but anybody want to give a tip? Because I thought it was a bit outrageous to come for a few minutes and share ideas that are mind-blowing. So I said it.
Y'all hear me laughing? I just wanted to thank everybody for coming, and please stay in contact, because if we're going to do this work collectively and collaboratively, we have to continue to stay in contact and establish relationships, not just rapport.
All you can say to that is Ashe. And amen.
All right. Well, thank you all for coming. This is wonderful.